Hello, everyone, and welcome to another live episode edition of the Ordinary People Doing Extraordinary Things podcast. I'm your host, Carrie Roberts, and today I have a wonderful expert guest with me today, Mr. Brad Adgate. He is a veteran media analyst and an independent media consultant and currently a Forbes contributor. He was named a media maven by Advertising Age and a media all-star in the research category by Adweek. For a number of years, he was named as the most quoted media executive by Advertising Age under their media annual survey. And Advertising Age also named him one of the 25 media people you should follow on Twitter. So welcome, Brad. Thank you for being here.
Hey, thanks, Carrie. Thank you for the invitation.
Yes. So you and I met a few months ago, and you've just been a kind soul and filled with knowledge. Before we get into really kind of all the data and all the things we're going to talk about today, I'd love to hear a little bit about how you personally got into media, because you studied political science and history in school. What got you into media in the very beginning?
That's a great question. I had no idea what I wanted to do. And, when I was in college, I went to the catalogs and said, geez, I'll take these courses. And I wound up with these two majors, and I worried about what I was going to do later. And actually, I don't really tell too many people this. I kind of took some aptitude tests and I answered these questions and things. And I know writer, artist, and musician were the top three. And dental hygienist was last. And advertising, but things like advertising was in the top 10. And I lived in New York, and I had some connections. I mean, my brother was a film editor doing some commercials, so he had some connections. And really, I just walked the streets of Manhattan with a resume, doing cold calls, and I got a job at a very small boutique shop called Case and McGrath, and they're not around anymore, but. And we went them in advertising back then. If you lost an account or lost an account or something like that, people were let go. So that's what happened to me. And then it worked out that I wound up going to Gray Advertising and working in research, working for Helen Johnston, who was a brilliant, the grande dame of media research. And she was, I just got really lucky. And from there, I just worked in a lot of. Then there were still Madison Avenue agencies, and then I worked working in sales research at some cable networks and in syndication and things. But I've always enjoyed. I spent most of my career working at ad agencies, and I always liked research. It was like, you didn't have to work on a specific account. You didn't have to work on a specific media or a specific demographic. You could kind of like every day you could work on newspapers, out of home, it was a lot easier back then. But so it was fun. So I got kind of became. I got exposed to a lot of things that I probably wouldn't have if I went somewhere else. So I just went from there.
Yeah, and you've done so much in this space, and I'm curious, when you think of the word media, what are you referring to? Are you talking about just TV and newspapers? Are you talking about social media, podcasting? What are you referring to in media?
Oh, and it's everything. It's all of that. I think it's all encompassing. Media is the message. What did Marshall McLuhan say? And so I think it's anything that's a messaging vehicle. It's what drives me crazy is that one, like, television is the medium, and media is plural. So that's that's one of my pet peeves. Just like data and data, man. It's one of those things like when someone says mediums. That's like a stack of shirts at the Gap or something. But it's really media. But I think it's really any messaging. It's anything that whether it's television, radio, I mean, it's exploded into other podcasting, which you're involved with. I mean, all of that is messaging, and it's gotten very niche and fragmented, and it's very different than it has been. But I consider all of it.
Yeah, and before we kind of get into the growth and changes of media over the years, especially after this, pandemic period, you and I were just talking offline a little bit about some of the history of media, and you had written in some of the Forbes articles as well. Can you talk about kind of this kind of history of media? You were talking about, this deal that was made in 1947. You were talking about, the importance of Jaws within marketing. Let's kind of go through just a little bit of the history here.
Well, a lot of these things, when I was working in an agency, I did a monthly newsletter that I sent out to clients and new business prospects and to the press, the media, and so I was always like exposed and writing about different things, and I also read a lot. When I worked in New York, I had like a 3 hour commute every day, and I just spent it reading. You get lemons, you make lemonade. You had this horrible commute, but I got my time to do what I want to do. So I read up a lot about that, and like for instance, we talked about Jaws, and I just wrote a piece for Forbes, and for instance, that's an example of how Hollywood kind of like works in seasons, and prior to Jaws, which came out in 1975, it was the holiday season was their big money maker, and now I think the holiday season, between Thanksgiving to New Year's Day, those are the movies that get real serious Oscar consideration, not necessarily box office hits, and it really switched to the summer, and since 2007, with the exception of 2017, the summer season has produced over $4 billion in box office receipts, and that's close to 40% of what the movie studios get in box office in the U.S. And it was interesting to me because I didn't know, I knew how important summer was. And I know that this summer's been really bad for the movie theaters and the studios. Things have been delayed, or they've gone straight to premium video on demand. But I have no idea how important Jaws was to that whole modern marketing concept of a movie. And we talk about Steven Spielberg. It was his third feature film. He was 27 years old, and it was a $7 million movie to produce, which is, again, that's 1975. But he started doing TV commercials, which nobody really did. He did a whole wall-to-wall primetime ads for Jaws. The movie opened up on a Friday, what most movies do. Starting Tuesday, just wall-to-wall. He had he made everybody available for interviews to promote the movie. I guess back then it was Johnny Carson, and then there was the paperback book with Peter Benchley. Was time to come. The paperback was time to come out at the time of the release of the film, and they put the movie poster on the book cover. There was merchandise. They got local newscasts to talk about sharks. I don't know if they did it, but the movie became so popular that you'd watch the local news and they'd be talking about sharks because Jaws was everyone was talking about. When 1975, it was the top grossing movie of all time. And that lasted for 2 years because Star Wars came out in 1977, and that kind of really continued pace to have on movies. TV's running reruns, and maybe we can, and that's how it evolved. And now, if you watch Avengers Endgame, premiered last year, April 24th, which is a week before the start of the summer season, and that grossed $850 million. So it just continues. And now I don't think there's too many movies that do $1 million a week because of the pandemic. So it's kind of interesting. It's kind of fun because you just learn stuff too, which is always good.
Yeah. And, obviously during the pandemic and even before, people were doing a lot of streaming. Maybe they weren't going to the movies as much. We recently saw Hamilton go on Disney Plus. I was reading one of your articles. You can give me the stat. I don't remember. I think it was around 74%. Maybe there was an increase.
Yeah.
But did I get that right? All right.
Yes.
74% increase in purchasing Disney Plus to be able to watch Hamilton.
Mm-hmm.
And they purchased it for what was it, like 75 million? Is that what?
Yeah, they acquired it. Lin-Manuel Miranda, I think a couple of years ago. I think they filmed it.
Yeah.
And that's, I haven't seen. I saw the show in New York, but apparently he used a lot of different camera angles. And I read an article about it, and he just loved it. When Disney showed it, they showed that they had it, and he really, I know that he really liked it. And what's interesting is, he has another Broadway show that's going to be a movie that's due to come out next summer called In the Heights.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll see what happens with that, based on the success of Hamilton. And that kind of talks to, what you talked earlier about, is this going to be a trend? I mean, with social distancing and,
Mm-hmm.
and, wearing masks and and you'll be able to eat food in theaters, and are you going to be willing to wait while they clean out the studios after each movie to go in? And there's all sorts of interesting things that could happen. But I think some of the theaters are going to start opening up, and hopefully they'll have some movies to watch. I know Walmart's turning their parking lots into drive-ins, which
Yes, which I love that the drive-ins are coming
yes.
back. I think that's great. And I had asked you, offline as well, is it possible for, let's say these AMC, these theaters don't make it because of the pandemic. Is there this possibility that Amazon, Netflix, Hulu open up their own movie theaters? And you had told me about this Supreme Court decision in 1947 about this. Can you talk about what that was?
Sure.
What happened?
Yeah, well, to kind of go back before that, it goes back about 100 years or so ago. A man named Adolf Zucker owned or ran Paramount Pictures, and we talk about cable bundling today, and how there's kind of a pushback that there is, and why should I pay for cable networks I'm never going to watch? They were doing that 100 years ago. Adolf Zucker would go to the movie theaters and say, "I got 12 pictures, and 11 of them stink, and you don't want them. But I have one with Mary Pickford that you're going to want, because he was the matinee idol of her day." And the theaters were kind of forced to take all these 12 pictures when they really wanted one. And then the theaters said, we're not doing this anymore. They kind of like they kind of got a backlash or pushback to Paramount. And Zucker silently or clandestinely started buying the theaters up. So he had his own distribution outlet, and that kind of created the so-called studio system. And he had his own, he made the shows, had the performers under contract, he had the distribution. And in 1947, there was a Supreme Court decision called Paramount versus the United States that said that the movie studios cannot own their own distribution. They can't own the theaters as well, and that's why Disney doesn't have any theaters today, or Warner Brothers, or Universal, or Sony, or Paramount. None of them own it. So I don't know. I don't know how much how much Netflix or Amazon, or some of these other, or Apple, who are producing content now, can get their own distribution outlet. I'm not, they'd have to, I haven't think that the decision's been overturned by the court, so I'm not sure. But that's an interesting time in 1947, because 1946 is still the record for movie attendance in the United States. You think
1946 was.
Yeah, it still is, because people back from the war, they're ready to get back from normal, big year for people getting married. And that's still the record attendance. I mean, not in box office, just at the price of a movie ticket now averages about $9.40, but back then it was a lot less. So they didn't do the gross box office today, but that was the last of the heyday, because the Supreme Court decision came, then television came, and then the Hollywood 10 and all the blacklisting, and people were getting communists and pointing fingers and McCarthyism and all that. So it changed since then. But you could tell this is just reading books. Okay,
it's real. I mean, it's interesting again to look at the history and kind of how it goes through. And I just wanted to show that Esther here agreed with you earlier, that she said medium is unnecessary in language when we're talking about media. So I love that she added that. Yeah,
well, it is medium.
Exactly.
Well, if singular is medium, and plural is media.
So tell us a little bit about what are some of the changes happening in media? And again, especially now, kind of during this pandemic era, what have you been seeing?
Well, we talk about movies and how people are not going to attendance, and you didn't talk about the pricing, that if you go to a movie theater, the studios kind of split, 50, the studios get about 50% the box office, and the theaters get around 40 to 50%. And if you go straight to, say, premium VOD, which is, you pay $20, you get a 48-hour window, the studio gets 80%. and the platform, if you will, the MVPD cable system, whatever it is, they get 20%. So, that model's changing. You got to think, because you don't really look at box office, the studios are looking at revenue, and if you can get more revenue on a just doing premium VOD or limited theater release and then putting it on another platform. I mean, so again, that's going to be something curious to see in the weeks ahead or months ahead. I think that a couple of things. I think esports has taken off in popular with everybody being closed. All the major sports, esports is phenomenal. Especially with young adults, men and women. I'd be curious to see how that plays out. I could see a cable network just devoted to esports, maybe with the ESPN on those Disney owned networks. It's to me, it's like watching paint dry, but people are really into watching other people play video games, and it's become very popular, and it's again a lot of blue chip advertisers. Newspapers. I think that you're seeing a lot of small, they're called like news deserts, where they're just not getting any coverage. They have alternate weeklies, which is how a lot of young journalists cut their teeth on before they got jobs at the New York Times or Washington Post. They're getting hammered pretty good, which is, the good news is that at least people are reading newspapers. I think that because there's so much news going on. It's just from a revenue perspective, they're so reliant on local retailers and community events and other things, and with all that shut down, they couldn't advertise. And you're seeing also movement with some of these big newspaper groups are being acquired by hedge funds, and they're stripping them, and they're cutting back on the coverage and things of that sort. And if you want to go back to history, how important newspapers were, but I think that was a movement that was coming. But again, this was this kind of expedite that movement. Nothing's how TV's bought and sold. I mean, with the upfronts, the whole process was just somebody just threw a hand grenade into it. I think it was the virus, and that beginning of middle of March, productions were shut down, and that's a time when, if you look at the calendar, the television studios are they're shooting pilots. They've already got the green light from the script, and they've hired cast members, and they're starting to shoot pilots and sending dailies to the entertainment presidents of the networks, and they're looking at the dailies, and then suddenly it just stopped. And
Yeah.
what happens is, in April they kind of make decisions, or they kind of evaluate, and salespeople talk to agency buyers and just say, okay, these are the type of shows we like. This is what's going on, and then you have the big upfront, and $20 billion are transacted, going on typically right now in June and July, and that's all been put on hold. And we don't know what's going to come this fall. We don't even know if the NFL is going to be here in the fall. I mean, I'd like to see it, and it's scheduled, but it'd be interesting to see how television's bought and sold. And there's a lot of people who think that the upfront and how advertising is bought and sold in a broadcast year. Nobody, it's not a fiscal year for any advertiser. It's the last week of September, and it's 52 weeks, and it's a very antiquated, but it works well for the networks, and I think some agencies still like it, and it'll be curious to see, because there's a push to make television but like digital, and instead of using adult 18 to 49 ratings, or things like that, just saying, okay, there are 5 million people who are gonna go to a movie this Friday, and how do I reach them on television? And taking data and integrating it with other set top box data, or even shall I say Nielsen people meter data, or things of that sort, and integrating that and coming up with a schedule that's closer to how digital is bought and sold. And I think there's a lot of people in the television industry who see the double digit growth that Facebook and Google and now Amazon are getting, and they're pretty much flat in terms of year to year growth. So again, this thing put on hold. I think what's going to happen is that the upfront will continue to some degree, but it'll be more like a calendar year. It'll start in January instead of the end of September, and which makes sense because a broadcast year, I mean, with streaming video and cable networks, and all that, no one really follows a broadcast year anymore. So may as well make it more in line with how the fiscal year of your clients.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. It's funny because you say that because you're right. Many years ago, it was always like September through May was like when the
Yeah,
shows were on, and you
yeah,
would watch it and be aware. Speaking of data, there's always a challenge of how do you measure an audience? How do you use data to kind of make media decisions, especially when we're talking about digital and television? Do you have
yeah.
any suggestions about that?
Oh boy, if I do that, well, I look, they're just issues. I mean, there's all sorts of issues in audience measurement. I mean, I wrote something yesterday for Forbes about out of home media and how that's going to be part of the currency. I mean, last week Nielsen flip flopped on that. Um, I think that a couple of things is that the audience has gotten so fragmented. I mean, you really need a robust sample to be able to measure what people are doing. Um, and then I think the part of it are how good is the data that you're getting? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
and how much are your clients willing to share that data? Because that's their to them that's their secret sauce. I mean, and they don't feel like sharing it because if you're working in an agency and say you're working on Coke, and I'll just simplify it, and then you go on to move to Pepsi, well, Coke doesn't want you to have all their kind of like sales figures or whatever type of data that they're using to make their media decisions. So it's a very, I mean, and that's just a part of it. I think some of it's like the relationship that advertisers have with their agency partners. Some of those things. There's been some things in the press over the past, say, 3 or 4 years about that relationship, and how sometimes the networks are just going directly to the clients and not going to the agencies to negotiate advertising time. There could be some changes taking place with that. Kind of based on who owns the data, who's willing to share the data, and how good is the data. I mean, the thing is if you have one data set that's 3 years old, another one that's 1 year old. I mean, do you really want to combine that and put it in, integrate both of them into your decision making process? There's a lot of work there, even with podcasting. I mean, you see that how
Mm-hmm.
fragmented it's become, and how difficult it is to get audience, and to get reliable ratings and things of that sort. And as it continues to grow and advertisers continue to support it and sponsor it, they want to know who's hearing them and who's listening to them, and what and did it move the needle? I mean, where's my return on investment?
Yeah, and it's interesting because with data, like you said, what's good data, what isn't. And I'm curious, what are some things people should be tracking when they're looking at media? I can speak to podcast people talk about downloads, but I always tell people that's not the only metric or the only thing that matters. So, do you have a suggestion of like what are some maybe the top 3 or 4 types of data that you should be looking at when you are looking at media?
Well, yeah, the key thing is that what there's like a marketing funnel that that's used. In the top of the funnel is like brand awareness and
Yep.
reach, and that's something that television does really well. But then when you get further on down the funnel, it's things like consideration or intent, and then you get to the bottom, and is it conversion? And I think every advertiser wants conversion, and who can best deliver that. And that's what makes digital media so popular, and that's why they're getting percent double digit growth every year, and why television are kind of creating these attribution models and using data and more robust panels, that go beyond what Nielsen's been doing, to kind of like to kind of to make it usable data. I mean, something like if you're an advertiser, something like podcasts. I was thinking that before, that, terrestrial radio gets a 92% reach, all of it every week. It's actually more than television, if you can believe it. But when you look at podcasts, you're looking at a niche audience. You're looking at the low hanging fruit. It's a very specific person that you're trying to reach. And that's true with magazines. That's been true with television. And it's going on with radio between, terrestrial or broadcast radio, and now you have these little niche podcasts that are popping up, like Michelle Obama launches one
Yeah.
today, right?
Yeah, and
So,
it's on
so you s-
Spotify only. So, they've worked a deal with
yeah,
her as well. So that's unique too.
yeah. Well, and that's what makes podcasting, I think, so popular, is that you're getting A-list talent,
Mhm.
like a Michelle Obama, and then you're getting, companies like Spotify and iHeartMedia and Sirius, and you're getting a lot of big companies now actively involved in that. What I think what will happen will, it'll be repped. You have a sales guy, and you'll just sell a bunch of, packages together, like doing local TV years ago, where you just kind of sit and say, okay, here's this, and you kind of sell it collectively to kind of get a more robust number. But you still want to get a number, and there's some studies, and it's directional, but it'll get there. It's just a lot of it is just, you need a large enough sample as media gets fragmented, because otherwise it's garbage in, garbage out.
Yeah. Yes. We have a couple of questions here from
Sure.
David Klein. He says, how do they really know who deserves credit for conversion in the funnel? That's a really good question.
Yeah, that is a great question. Well, I think that it's a God, that's a question that I ask.
Hmm.
Yeah, I know, David. Um, I think it really comes down to, it's a combination of everything, really. He's talking about, if you have a multimedia plan, which is what most, if you have a huge budget, you're going to spend a lot of money on, in advertising, and so it's a combination of different things, and I think that it's I don't think, the answer is that's really hard to tell. I mean, I wish I had a really good answer for that, Dave, but I think that television. I'll say this: everybody knew that television worked, because television was working before there was digital media, and advertisers are very comfortable, and that's still why that's a $70 billion industry. I think the difficulty has been having to prove that it works, and I think that they're working on that with these attribution models, and it's I think these models are just designed to keep the money in television, and I do think the answer is that's pretty hard to do at this stage, and I'm sure there might be some companies doing it, but
Yeah, and I wanted his other question earlier as well was, with OTT services not carrying the local TV station, what becomes the future for them, local news and the major league sports packages they all have?
so OTTs are not carrying local TV stations. Yeah, well, there's cord cutting, and so people still need terrestrial TV to, or put the antenna back on. I don't think, TV stations are in financial dire straits, because they're starting to get, subscriber fees from MVPDs, and you're starting to get, like Scripps or Hearst or Disney or these big station groups. They're getting a second revenue stream the same way that cable networks get, and they're actually getting a lot of money for that. ESPN gets the most, because they get like $8-9 a home, a subscriber, although they haven't been putting on much lately, outside of the Last Dance and Korean baseball. Uh, but so I think what we're going to see is, first of all, these stations are putting out their own streaming video, providers. They're putting out things like, I think Gamut, or Tegna. Some of these groups are providing, their own streaming opportunities, that they're selling nationally. And the second thing is, I would suspect in the near future the FCC is going to relax, ownership rules. Right now, that stations can only own 39% of, the country and TV households, and so I would suspect that in the in the years ahead. I mean, every year they're petitioning in front of the FCC to get, to relax ownership rules, and I think once they're able to do that, they'll go after national advertisers the way that the broadcast networks and cable networks are doing. So I don't think that's a it's you know I if people were down on TV stations, they wouldn't be people wouldn't be buying them, and they are.
Yeah.
Nexstar just bought Tribune and things of that. So
Yeah, I mean, I love that you're blending again all the history, what's going on now, what your thoughts are for the future to bring it all together. Our big question here of this show, Brad, was how do companies develop actionable insights, generate revenue, and raise their marketplace profile? And I know that's a lot in one question, but what is your response to that?
could you repeat the question? That was a lot.
Yeah. How can companies develop actionable insights
Oh, okay.
and generate revenue and raise their marketplace profile? So they're
Well,
trying to do all three, obviously. What are yeah.
look, insights will produce revenue. So, I'm talking to a research person. I think you have to invest in insights. You have to invest in, you have to evaluate, what are the services out there, the research services or the data providers that are out there. How is that going to work? I think that, agencies are and companies like Comcast, they're hiring data scientists left and right. They're having like a technical service groups. They're very integrated into these meetings. So first of all, I think you need insights. You have to, and insights will let your clients know how smart you are, and the smarter you are, they're gonna spend revenue on it. I mean, but I've always thought that research is where the rubber hits the road. It's where you can make actionable decisions. When we I think every advertising agency or even networks have develop their own proprietary tools, their own black box, where they kind of th- you know integrate different data sets and put together a compelling presentation, and with the idea being that these guys are really smart. I'm going to go with them. And yeah, it's very competitive out there, and I think that the amount of data that's now become available, now it's being used, in this industry, has a lot of opportunity to show people how smart they are, do something unique, do something different. Um, and of course, using the press and media and having a great, PR department to kind of promote that and things of that sort is also, very helpful in, getting a place at the table. So I hope I answered that. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I know these are hard questions as
Yeah.
well, and
I don't know
obviously,
if I answered the last part of it.
so I mean, we're looking at we have two different sides here when we talk about media. You have the media companies that are
Yeah.
trying to get people to buy, put their ads. They're trying to get revenue from them, and then
Yeah.
you have the organizations, the companies that are looking for either brand awareness or attention or conversions. From either side, what is maybe one piece of advice you have for media companies and one piece of advice you have for companies that are buying from media companies that they should focus on or look for, especially in 2020 after this pandemic?
Well, I think that transparency is probably the best, to being honest and upfront, not to bring up the upfronts again. But I think that, knowing what you want and being able to, um, provide actionable insights, and to be, there's so many things that are done in a dark room, and like I talk about what's in a black box. They don't really want you to know what's in the black box, because it could be just junk. So I think that that's probably the best. The other thing is, it's still relationships. I think that it's very, it's still a relationship business. I know that, kind of like the programmatic buying is kind of like taking over a lot, in digital. It's migrating into television, but really it's still a relationship business. It's really great to go on the phone. It's really great to, to meet, to go out, go to some events, go to things, kind of like, I was reading something today about, how that con wasn't around this year because of the pandemic. And Zoom has, I think, kind of like taken away from, in this pandemic, that, that human touch, because everything's being done remotely, and to kind of sit back and be in an office setting, and interact, and take clients out, and things of that sort. I think that's really an important, relationship, and I don't think that's going to change, or I hope it doesn't change. I think it'll change to some degree, and I think a lot of it is automated buying, and kind of like bypassing, that human touch. And I think that would work on both sides of the
Yes.
of the relationship, buying and selling. And honesty's always help. When you work in research, that's what I like about research, is you're always objective, you're not subjective, and so this is it. And it's either yes or no. There's no gray area. It's going to work or it's not. It's things like
Yeah. Yes, I agree. Having that research, having that data, but also there's still the human touch. There's still the relationships, the partnerships you're building, which, like you said, is a lot easier when you can go out and physically be around people. But because we can't do that, I think it still can be done over the phone, over Zoom, whatever it is. It just has to be finessed a little bit different. So I'm really glad that you're bringing that to light as well. David has one other question, kind of what we're talking about. I love this. David is on fire tonight. When do the agencies finally tear down their internal walls and bring linear and digital buying together at one desk in one department?
I think that's coming. Actually, I there's a lot of meetings taking place, and I think I think the agencies are, sometimes they can bring in like a senior, say, traditional media buyer, and then a young digital buyer, or they kind of like work in a client by client scenario, where, okay, you're working on Procter and you're working on Johnson and Johnson. They have just these teams, and they're all kind of siloed and codified into this one group. I think that's some scenario. I think agencies are buying a lot of digital companies or data companies, like Axiom and Merck have been bought by some of the big holding companies, and so they're getting more data infused. But I think eMarketer did. I wrote something about connected TV, and I noted that eMarketer now, they're moving more towards a one desk department, if you will. I think they expect that by next year it'll be over 60% of agencies will have that. So it's increasing with every year, where you have digital and traditional buyers working in the same room on the same account with the quote unquote same jersey on. And clients can help that too, because sometimes clients will go to their digital agency, and instead of going to the traditional agency, when they should be doing both. They can play games with agencies with that too. So I think it's in everyone's best interest that it does stay, that it gets to be unified, and that the agencies kind of but the sellers have to do, have to do.
Yeah. Working together. I mean, it makes sense what you're saying. And,
and cross-platform measurement, needs to step up too. I mean, it's not that great. Nielsen has come out with some stuff, some products that were shot down by the industry and things of that sort. And so, there's a measurement issue too with cross-platform. And then what even type of, do you use traditional metrics like GRPs, or do you use, audience-based buying like you do in digital and things of that sort? So, there's a, it's just that the industry for years have kind of used as one set of rules, and now it's like the Wild West, and it's all over the place, and the agencies are all doing different things, and the media companies are doing different things, and we've been so used to just one set of rules, and that's not the way business is going to be done in the future, which makes it a little more challenging, but it may turn out to be better.
Yeah, no, I agree. There's definitely a lot of different things. Everybody's giving something different, and you don't always know what is the right thing. So as you said, it goes back to understanding the research and insights, but also having a relationship and kind of a partnership as well. If you're watching and you have any other questions, you can put them in for these last few moments. I want to just switch gears for a second, Brad, because You were talking to me a little bit earlier about the 2020 election ad
Yeah.
dollars. And regardless of where people are politically, where are they putting that money now? I think it was during, probably, correct me if I'm wrong, like before the 2008 election is really when they kind of first went into the social media. Would that be correct? Like, now that we're looking at this in 2020, where do you see it going? How has it changed?
It's all going to North Carolina. No, no, actually, it's well, it's just going to go to two places. Well, one is geographic and one is demographic. Yeah, it's going to be, obviously there are these states in play, and that started with Bill Clinton in 1992. Before that, presidential ad dollars were just network. And there's these things on the broadcast networks, maybe CNN or whatever, when that was around. And then, Clinton says, no, I'm going to spend it in Ohio, Missouri, and these what were then swing states. This is going to, and so, that kind of followed, and we still have it. That's why we have red states and blue states and purple states. So North Carolina is a purple state. And I just said it because they have a really tight Senate race with the incumbent up, first-time incumbent, and they have a really tight governor's race, and then you have a really tight presidential race. So if you're a TV station in Charlotte, to answer Dave's question earlier, they're going to make a ton of money in Charlotte, North Carolina this year. But and part of it is also, so there's North Carolina, there's Florida, you know what they are, Michigan, Wisconsin, things like that. That's where they're going to get them all. New York, you're not going to see anything. Or California, or Oklahoma, or states that are solid red or solid blue, they're not going to see anything. But I think also it's interesting about targeting too, and I wrote a piece from these for Forbes. These kids were doing this write up on Facebook on where the candidates were spending their money and how they were spent geographically and demographically, and who they were targeting. And I think we'll see for the president, you've already saw him. He's lost a lot of, at least in the polls are showing, he's lost his popularity with senior citizens and suburban women. So, you might see them using social media, or say local cable, or some other geo-demographic or sub, TV market, radio, metro, strategy to kind of like capture that, because that helped them get elected in 2016. So, you're going to see all sorts. You're going to see all sorts of. There's a lot of money out there, and you're going to see all sorts of different strategies, and of course the issue is, how much of it's real and how much of it isn't on these social media platforms. But
and I think you and I talked about last fall. You were talking about this idea. I don't know if it'd be this election, but maybe 4 years from now, of them potentially putting ads on podcasts. Having these relationships, because like you said, there are these niche areas. And in a recent article you did on Forbes, you talked about even though people are streaming, because people wanted to know about the news with coronavirus, Black Lives Matters, all of these things going on, they're watching more Fox, CNN, MSNBC. Yeah. And so they're aware of what's going on a lot more.
Yeah, that's something I posted yesterday from a company called Video Amp, and it's just how much time and they're spending. And not only that, what I think the gist of it to me was also, in talking with them, is how much of a bump CNN gets with this. They rank third, but they've been around for 40 years. People are familiar with them. Fox News and MSNBC have a much higher baseline of viewers. People are going to turn to them whether it's news or not, because it's just kind of it's become a destination channel and habit for me. CNN was kind of is third. If there's like a late breaking news, or there's heightened news events, they always get a spike in audience. And I noticed that in the study that they put together. They talk about robust. They had like 9 million smart TV sets with audience ACR, audience composition research, and audience content research. And so it was very, it's kind of insightful. I'm fascinated by how people get news. It's as newspapers start to lose circulation and readership, especially among young people. People are migrating, and I worked at CNN during the Persian Gulf War in my younger days, and it was just incredibly fascinating about how younger it got when, because news is generally an older audience, which is not very appealing. I mean, you see the ads on news, it's all for these, wonder drugs for aging baby boomers, uh, and because that's who's watching it, and pharmaceutical ads. But but how young people get their news is very interesting too. On social media platforms.
I mean, I'm in my 30s, and I don't like watching the news because it's negative most of the time, so it's a lot to take in. But now I will look at trending under Twitter, or now there's
Yeah,
like a little like it looks like a piece of paper icon in Facebook, and it shows like the headlines, and
yeah,
that's enough actually for me,
yeah.
because it's a very quick way of like to stay updated, but also maybe if I don't really want to watch it or hear it, I can
Yeah.
just swipe it away. So it's interesting that, yeah, that's kind of how I'm looking at news nowadays.
And Kerry, you're not alone.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a lot of people who do that. I mean, it's a generational thing. I remember I was at a dinner at Bloomberg, and I sat next to this guy who was running BuzzFeed, and this is years ago, and I'd never heard of BuzzFeed, and he goes, "Text your daughter." So I did, in just all caps. It's my life. I, okay, yeah, I guess you're big.
Yeah, I mean, thinking about how that company started, yeah, it was kind
Yeah,
of like this funny little thing on the side, and now has become a news source in a sense. So it's changing a lot.
yeah,
One of the other things I want to just finish up here with is you also had talked about in an article not too long ago, about, whenever there is some sort of economic crisis or worry, people usually take money out of ad dollars. And in
yeah,
fact, I know recently you had said people were spending less money on Google ads, but it really should be the reverse. There was some sort of quote that you had in there that, you should be spending your ad dollars, but when it's a bad economy, you must spend them.
yeah.
Can you speak to that, what that means?
Sure. Yeah. Well, yeah, that was an article I wrote in September, back when the yield curve was inverted, and I thought, oh, there'll be a recession, and it didn't happen to the pandemic, and it grew in popularity. But there's been all sorts of studies and all sorts of reasons on why you should continue to advertise. Among them is that the noise level is lower, so you
Mm-hmm.
could stand out. Because advertising rates are based on demand. If there's a lower demand, you'll get better pricing. It's good to switch the messaging around to meet the needs of the times. That you're a stable blue chip advertiser. And we've seen probably about half the ads on TV now, or that I've seen, are we're in this together, we're going to get to this. I mean, that's kind of that type of messaging, and that there's I think the quote was, if times are good, you should advertise, and when times are bad, you must advertise. And there's all sorts of studies. I mean, and you could go through test cases going back to the Great Depression, when Post cereals pulled their ads and Kellogg's were doing Snap, Crackle, and Pop ads on radio, the new media of the day. And they took over, controlled market share that lasted for decades. And there's all sorts of other examples with, Toyota not pulling their ads during the oil crunch and advertising how fuel efficient they were. And then they surpassed Volkswagen as the top imported auto in the US. And it's just, and I'm sure there'll be some studies done in this, but I think I think it's a very kind of, the first reaction is to pull your ads, because if revenue's dropping, you could say, okay, where can I save money, where can I cut costs, and one of the faces they look at is their advertising budget. And if you can get away with it. I mean, obviously, if you're shut down for 3 or 4 months, it's hard to rationalize advertising. Which happened to a lot of companies, and mom and pop shops in these times. But for some of the other ones, um, I think it's important to do that. And the other thing is that without sports, you're seeing a lot of sports advertisers, they have nowhere to spend their money. You look at automotive, or you look at some tech companies, or financial services or insurance, some of these big heavy advertisers that you would see during, the NBA finals or the Major League Baseball or things like that. So we've seen some cutbacks, percent double digit compared to a year ago, but some of that could just be, well, there's no March Madness.
Yeah.
I was going to spend $200 million on it. What do I do?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point, because I think for people that are looking for advertising dollars, there are people there that do actually have the money, like you said,
Yeah.
and just kind of reaching out and being creative. So no, I think that's a good point.
I'll just close out with Sam Walton's line, because that was the kicker line in the article. They the CEO of Walmart, founder and CEO of Walmart, and they asked him. They asked me what I was going to do with the recession, and I decided I wasn't going to participate.
Yes, and that's a hard thing to do, because that's a mindset thing.
Not for him.
Right. Yeah, probably not for him, but yeah. I think you're right. It makes a big difference to push through, to take advantage when people are pulling out. Brad, if people want to connect with you or ask questions, where is the best place to do that?
Well, I'm on LinkedIn and I'm on Twitter. So either one is, I'm not still in social media.
Yes, he's all over social media. And again, he's writing in Forbes quite often, so you can follow him and all his articles there as well. I thank you so much, Brad, for, again, not only your education and knowledge on this, but just your passion for it and your kindness and sharing what you know. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Carrie. Enjoyed it.